Shigaraki is a great character, but an okay villain. He inspired a manga arc unlike any other, but it has one major flaw. It made him just another statistic. Meanwhile, Zodyl from Gachiakuta has a similar background and does basically the same thing. But there's one big difference. He doesn't need any friends and just wants to see the world burn. And this difference leaves us with an important question. How do we write compelling characters without ruining them as villains? That's why in this video, I'm going to compare Shigaraki and Zodyl, discuss the difference between good characters and good villains, and explain why great villains don't need backstories. And the best place to start is with Shigaraki's backstory in My Villain Academia. Because as brilliant as this arc is, it ultimately led to the downfall of Shigaraki's role as a major villain. And the reason that happened is because Horikoshi made him an amazing character. To be clear, My Villain Academia needs to be praised for what it accomplished. In a world of manga that are dominated by Friezas and Dios, MVA did something that no manga had ever done before. It delivered an arc where the main characters were barely even mentioned and made the antagonists the villains of their own story. For that reason, it is still one of the greatest arcs in all of fiction, but it's also the reason Shigaraki ultimately fails as a villain, because Horikoshi's goal of giving him the writing he deserves was unintentionally self-defeating. See, the purpose of MVA is basically to give the League of Villains their own spotlight, to watch them in their own context and elevate them as more nuanced characters. It works great for Toga and Twice, and at the time, it did wonders for Shiggy. We watch as the hero society that abandoned his family inspires him to hate everyone and everything. We understand that while he knows he's still a villain, Shigaraki is motivated by a desire to rebel against the hero society that failed him. But here's the problem with that. While this new context makes Shigaraki an amazing character, it undermines him as a villain because of the way it complicates the influence behind his decisions. The problem is now it's not just Shigaraki deciding to destroy the world. It's also the decision of his father to abuse him, the decisions of his family not to save him, and especially the decision of All for One to manipulate him. This last part is especially undermining because while we understand Shigaraki to be a failure of the system, now he's just another statistic that All for One can use for his gain. And this is exactly what we see happen when, after everything Horikoshi does to turn Shigaraki into the ultimate final boss, he places All for One in total control and shows Deku saying that Shigaraki just wants to be saved. And that's the problem with giving him this big backstory. It makes him an amazing character, but it ruins him as a villain. Now, to that point, you might say that you needed to give Shiggy this kind of backstory. Otherwise, he would be just another one-dimensional villain like Frieza or Dio or whoever. And while that is true, it ignores the underlying problem. It's not the backstory itself, but the fact that it portrays Shigaraki as a victim rather than the villain of his own story. It's like Christoph Waltz says about his portrayal of Hans Landa. He doesn't play the character thinking he's the bad guy. Nobody really views themselves as the bad guy, but there's a difference between not seeing yourself as the villain and still behaving like a bad guy, and not seeing yourself as the villain and being treated as if you are anything but evil. With Shigaraki, the problem is that you have these conflicting narratives of him being the villain of his own story, but also he's really a victim of All for One's mustache twirling schemes. And that's why the backstory is ultimately self-defeating. But that's the thing. If we avoid backstories completely, then all we have are these cartoonish villains that just want to take over the world, and not the cool ones like Dr. Doom. So how do we balance this need for characterization with the concern of undermining the villains? Well, this is where a character like Zodyl comes in. The funny thing is, it seems like I'm setting him up to be totally different, but Zodyl and Shigaraki are surprisingly similar. Zodyl is the leader of the bandit group known as the Raiders. Like Shiggy, he wants to destroy the world. he also seems to be motivated by a desire to upset the system. We know this because he talks about fighting the status quo and shocking the system. We don't know the full story just yet, but there's been a number of hints that this is in response to the society created by the upper echelon, the sphere that the main character Rudo is from, not unlike the way Shigi is acting against the Society of Heroes. These are all things that are very similar to the way Shigaraki behaves. And yet, there's one big difference. Zodyl has no friends. He has plenty of allies. He's got an entire team of haters he put together, almost like the ultimate team of Pokemon with all of the best abilities. But it's never once implied that they're his friends. In fact, he often mentions how he only picked them because of their abilities and never because of their character. And the way he talks implies that he ultimately views human beings as worthless. Like, unless you serve some purpose that he sees as useful, just existing is a waste. And in his own words, all trash needs to be thrown away. This is completely different from Shigaraki, who genuinely enjoys the company of the League of Villains. Shigaraki is often portrayed as the friend they all needed, especially when it comes to Spinner. He hates heroes, but can have a good time with other villains. Zodyl is such a lunatic that he really just hates everyone. But why am I bringing this up, and what does it have to do with backstories? Well, it all comes down to the difference between good characters and good villains. We all know a good character when we see one. It's a character that's interesting and enjoyable to watch. The same can be said for villains, but the difference is that villains can't be just another character. Villains are there to oppose the main character. This means that they need to be both physically terrifying as well as mentally terrifying. And the issue of backstories ties into the mental factor, because when we get Shigi's backstory, this humanizes him. It makes him a good character, but now that we understand him, we don't really fear him. The reason Zodyl is such a great villain, even though he has all of the same qualities of Shigaraki, is that we never really understand what he's doing or why he does these things. We can understand why he picks allies for their abilities, and we can understand the logic behind wanting to destroy the upper class. But Zodyl also says and does a lot of things that never really make sense. In his words, he shocks the system. For example, he often eats birds or bugs, which a lot of people think is tied into his ability, but we don't know exactly what his ability is yet, or whether that has anything to do with his powers, or if he just eats bugs because he's completely bonkers. And he hints at being raised by people who worship trash, but we don't know if this actually happened, and even if it did, this doesn't necessarily mean that that's why he eats animals like a psycho. There's all of these hints of his motivation, but that's just it. They're all hints. They're pieces of context, but they don't let us completely understand him. But I already know what you're thinking. It's easy to compare these characters when one of them is finished, while the other one is from a manga that isn't even 200 chapters, which is definitely fair. But we've known Zodyl for a while now. On top of that, we have gotten pieces of his backstory and not just random hints. This scene here seems to imply that Zodyl is motivated by some sort of betrayal that took place when he was younger, not unlike the way Shigaraki's family betrayed him. But again, the difference is we're given the whole picture with Shigi, so it's hard to fear him. With Zodyl, even if it's still early, everything we learn about him only creates more mystery. Like, even when we get this small piece of his backstory, it really doesn't answer that much. If anything, it just creates more questions and obscures any attempt to understand him. And that's what makes him such a good villain. Not only is he terrifying in his appearance and his abilities, but he's also terrifying because he can't be understood and even refuses to be understood. In this way, Zodyl is a lot like the Joker. As a matter of fact, the Joker is the best way I can think to describe Zodyl versus Shigaraki. If I were to make a comparison, I would say Shigaraki is like Joker in The Killing Joke, while Zodyl is more like Joker from Batman the Animated Series. In The Killing Joke, Alan Moore shows us the story of how Joker was a failure in life who didn't have the same upbringing as Bruce Wayne. We see that he became the Joker partly because of Batman and partly because he's a victim. Even if we don't agree with him, this context still humanizes the Joker. But in Batman the Animated Series, the Joker abuses his backstory. When Harley claims she heard the Joker's story and wants to save him, Batman says that the Joker is always making up stories to fool people. He even quotes some of them to prove the Joker has done this before. But here's the genius of what the Joker does. The fact that he even tells these stories gets us wondering if they're actually true. It's almost like in the Dark Knight movie. Joker tells all these conflicting stories, but they all have commonalities. So they're probably lies, but something about them seems true. This approach to the Joker's backstory obscures his motivations, but it's that mystery that makes him more engaging as we try to understand someone who refuses to be understood and just wants to see the world burn. And it's that same mental warfare that makes Zodyl a terrifying villain. Shigaraki doesn't play that game. He really just wants to destroy the stuff he doesn't like. This makes him physically and visually terrifying. And there's no doubt that he's a villain, especially when he is fully aware that what he's doing makes him the bad guy. But when it comes to that psychological aspect, there's two things that undermine Shiggy as a villain. The context around him only makes it clear that he's just another statistic in the failure of hero society that's being manipulated by someone meaner. And on top of that, you're not mentally afraid of him when you can rationalize where he's coming from. You understand how a victim would want to rebel, and just like Deku does, it naturally makes you want to save him rather than stop him. But when it comes to Zodyl, everything he does is psychological warfare. He is completely opposed to notions of common sense. He doesn't care about being liked or persuading people to his cause. He truly just wants to break the system and destroy the world. Maybe this doesn't give him the kind of depth as Shigaraki, but we get enough nuance in his character that strikes the perfect balance between context and mystery. He refuses to be understood, and that's what makes him so menacing. Granted, this can be viewed as a matter of preference. I'm sure a lot of people would argue Shigaraki and characters like him are much more interesting to read about. But more often than not, it's a lot harder to humanize a villain and still have them properly retain their role as the bad guy. When you give just enough context without ruining the mystery of the character, that's when you have a truly great villain.